In 1990, Disney screened a movie that made audiences cry for all the wrong reasons. They didn't want the romantic comedy they paid for, they wanted refunds. The film was called Pretty Woman, but what they watched wasn't pretty at all. The original heroine was a cocaine addict who didn't brush her teeth. The businessman threw money at her face and left her screaming in an alley. Test audiences were horrified, so Disney buried that version and gave the world Pretty Woman instead. But the original script still exists, and it's nothing like you remember. In 1983, Jonathan Frederick Lawton was 23, broke, and barely surviving in Los Angeles. He lived in a tiny one-room studio apartment in the rough Rampart district. The alley outside his window was a never-ending stream of dealers, pimps, prostitutes, and cops. Lawton had dropped out of film school and written 7 full screenplays, but nobody had ever read a single word. He was desperate, doing any tech job he could get just to buy himself another month in that grim neighborhood. At one point, he was coding and testing software just to afford food. Rejected again and again, even his romantic relationship collapsed, leaving him both heartbroken and completely alone. He wrote ninja scripts, comedies, anything he thought Hollywood might notice, but nothing clicked. Until one moment changed everything. That moment started with a computer. A producer named Gary Goldstein had just lost $80,000 on a failed movie. Trying to regroup, he bought a new Apple Macintosh, but didn't know how to set it up. A friend recommended Lawton, who spent 3 weeks getting the system running. During that time, Goldstein asked him casual questions, found out about the unread scripts, and finally asked to read one. That one led to 2 more. Then Goldstein said, "Forget the agent. You're good. I want to work with you." That's how 3000 was born. Lawton was asked to write a romance, but it had to feel real, emotionally raw, something rooted in truth. So he poured in what he saw out his window. Broken women, survival, transactions. He poured in his own heartbreak. The original title, $3,000, wasn't symbolic. It was literal. That's what Edward paid Vivian for 1 week of her time. The story had urgency. Just 7 days to feel something, to change. The script wasn't cute. It wasn't charming. It was cold, brutal, real. It stripped romance away and laid bare the transaction. A man renting a woman, nothing more. Lawton wasn't just telling a love story. He was warning people. The Reagan era was in full swing. Greed ruled everything. The Wall Street mindset had seeped into every corner of life. People were assets, disposable, purchased, and dumped. Edward was originally written as one of those cold, clean-suited monsters. Vivian was a shell of a person, hollowed out by years of surviving on the streets. The tagline was blunt: "Humiliation is for the shy, fear is for the innocent." Lawton wanted people to look at how far gone society had become. Vivian wasn't the smiling, quirky Julia Roberts character people remember. She was wrecked. In Lawton's script, she'd spent 6 years on the streets. She was a drug addict. Her eyes were blank. She didn't believe in love or in herself. She didn't brush her teeth. She didn't pretend to be clean. Patricia Arquette read that script and said it felt more like a European art film than anything Hollywood had ever dared to make. Kit, Vivian's roommate, was even worse off. She coughed constantly, her body giving out from drug abuse. In the original ending, Kit died from an overdose. Vivian was alone again, left behind by everyone, just like she expected. Even Edward wasn't redeemable. He saw Vivian as a tool. Their first meeting was just a game to him. She was a body, nothing more. When their week ended, he threw her out of the car and tossed the money on top of her like trash. There was no rescue, no fairy tale. The story ended on the same streets where it started. And it wasn't just the characters. The whole world of the script was gritty, desperate. Vivian's deal with Edward included a rule: no cocaine for a week. That's how deep her addiction ran. In one scene that didn't make it to the final film, she threatened to knock him out and walk away. In another, she nearly got attacked by her drug dealer. Disney's execs hated it. Too dark, too honest. So they scrubbed it, gave the drug storyline to Kit, made Vivian more relatable, softer. The truth was too sharp. Despite that, the script caught the eye of Sundance. It was accepted into their screenwriting workshop. It had weight. It had something that cut. Vestron Pictures picked it up first. But when they went under, Touchstone stepped in. A bidding war followed. The winning number? $17 million. For a story about a drug-addicted prostitute and a heartless businessman. Disney had plans, though. Big changes. Gary Marshall was brought in as director, and he turned it upside down. Vivian became Rapunzel. Edward became Prince Charming. Hector Elizondo, the hotel manager, became a fairy godmother. They weren't just changing lines, they were rewriting the soul of the story. And it nearly didn't happen. Meg Ryan read the original script and walked away immediately. No notes, no interest. Julia Roberts wasn't the first pick. Michelle Pfeiffer and Al Pacino were considered as leads, but both dropped out. The tone was too rough, too bleak. Patricia Arquette, Daryl Hannah, Winona Ryder. They all passed or were passed over. Daryl Hannah even called it degrading. And who could blame her? The original script didn't dress anything up. It showed women chewed up and tossed aside by a system built on money and survival. One by one, the actresses said no. Not because they couldn't act it, but because it was too real, too close, too painful. Even Diane Lane, who came very close to landing the part, later said it was too realistic for comfort. She remembered the ending clearly. Vivian thinking this man loved her, only to be kicked out of a moving limo. It wasn't Pretty Woman. It was a tragedy. And yet, against every odd, Disney reworked it into something glossy and sellable. A feel-good movie. They called it a modern Cinderella story. It made $178 million in the US alone. A sanitized version of what could have been one of the darkest and most honest portraits of human transaction in modern cinema. What started as a cautionary tale ended as a box office fairy tale. In 1989, Al Pacino came within inches of taking on the role of Edward Lewis in what would become one of the most iconic romantic films of all time, Pretty Woman. He sat across from Julia Roberts in a full table read, scripts in hand, chemistry being tested in real time. Hollywood insiders said it looked promising. But Pacino, who had just built a towering legacy from roles like Tony Montana in Scarface and Frank Keller in Sea of Love, decided to walk away. No one knew exactly why. He had liked the script, even did camera tests, but something didn't sit right. Had he accepted, the film's heart would have beat differently. His signature brooding energy would have turned the light romance into something sharp-edged. A story less about healing and more about collision. Director Gary Marshall later admitted that had Pacino taken the role, the ending would likely never have been happy. He pointed to the original screenplay titled 3000, where there were no fairy tales, only brutal realism. Vivian wasn't the lovable, witty dreamer we came to know. She was a hardened addict. Edward wasn't a man learning to love. He was a man buying power. Disney, who had final say, wanted a lighter script. They told Marshall flat out, "This needs to change." He came from the world of sitcoms, of happy endings and applause tracks. There was no way he could have directed the story with Pacino's darker intensity without the entire thing slipping back into the gutter it was written in. Before Pacino was even part of the conversation, the casting list looked like a wild tour through late 80s stardom. Christopher Reeve auditioned and stormed out, disgusted by the film's content. Daniel Day-Lewis was considered. Kevin Kline, Denzel Washington, and even Sting were on the table. Liam Neeson, Albert Brooks, Burt Reynolds, and Michael Douglas were all approached. Sam Neill, Tom Conti, and Charles Grodin did chemistry reads with Roberts. Many of them passed as soon as they read the words on the page. A love story built around prostitution wasn't something they wanted attached to their names. Sylvester Stallone and John Travolta didn't even entertain it. Their agents passed on the script immediately. Travolta did a camera test with Roberts, but it didn't click. Stallone didn't even bother. At that point, the script still carried the stench of the original version. Dark, explicit, unapologetic. No one could figure out how to market a movie about a sex worker and a cold millionaire. They saw it as career suicide. It wasn't until Julia Roberts herself sent Richard Gere a handwritten note that he changed his mind. He had already refused multiple times, but something in that note flipped a switch. And what a flip it was! Because the original script wasn't what we got. It was called 3000, because that's how much Edward was going to pay Vivian. It wasn't romantic. It wasn't charming. It was a psychological autopsy. Edward used her, broke her, threw money at her face, and drove off into the distance. In one draft, she overdoses. In another, she stares out of a dirty bus window, headed to Disneyland, broken and silent. Kit, her friend, coughed blood. Vivian wasn't saved. She was swallowed. This was a world where love wasn't a word, only leverage. Julia Roberts wasn't even supposed to be in the film for long. When she first got the role, the film was being made by a company called Vestron Pictures. She signed her contract. She was thrilled. And then 3 days later, the company collapsed. Gone. Just like that. No paycheck. No set. No career breakthrough. It was 1989, and she was 21 years old. She'd landed the biggest role of her life in a gritty indie drama, only for the entire production house to vanish. Vestron had been behind Dirty Dancing and had hundreds of employees, but their $100 million credit line evaporated, and within weeks, the studio crumbled. Roberts was left with nothing. When Jeffrey Katzenberg at Disney first got hold of the script, it wasn't even called Pretty Woman. It was called 3000. That number represented the exact amount of money a cold, ruthless businessman was willing to pay a woman he saw as disposable. The script was brutal. In the final scene, he throws her out of the car, tosses a pile of cash at her like trash, and drives away while she screams in the street. Vivian, broken and bitter, ends up on a bus staring into nothing, while her friend Kit tries to cheer her up about a trip to Disneyland paid for with sex work money. That was the tone. Grim, cynical, and painfully real. A movie that ended in heartbreak, not hope. But Disney didn't want that. Not even close. They brought in Gary Marshall to clean it up. His exact job was to supervise the rewrite and make it lighter. Way lighter. The studio didn't just want a new ending, they wanted a whole new movie. They wanted a love story, a fairy tale. Two strangers from different worlds, falling for each other despite the odds. The gritty world of drugs and emotional detachment had no place in this fantasy. Marshall later admitted he couldn't root for either character in the original. No sympathy, no heart, just darkness. So the studio went to work. Not with one writer, but 5. J.F. Lawton, the original writer, tried first. He removed Edward's girlfriend and softened Vivian's rough edges. But that didn't land either. The execs told him he'd gone too far. It was now too light, and still somehow too dark. he got fired. The next round of writers included Barbara Benedek, Stephen Metcalf, Robert Garland, and possibly Marshall himself. Each one was handed the script like a broken puzzle, trying to piece it together in a way that still fit Disney's dream, but didn't feel fake. Benedek was the breakthrough. The only woman on the writing team, she figured out Edward's character in a way no one else could. Vivian's voice had always been clear, but Edward, cold, rich, detached, needed layers. Benedek gave him vulnerability, softness behind the steel. Marshall later said she made him human. She transformed him from a Trump-style tycoon into someone worth caring about. That shift saved the romance. It made the fire escape ending possible. Without her, there's no way audiences would have believed he'd come back for her at all. Meanwhile, Metcalf and Garland were handed a very specific job. Take out the coke, take out the sociopath, take out Kit's death, take out the scream in the street. Disney wanted charm, not trauma. They worked separately, each version sanding off more of the harshness. Metcalf even admitted the script he first read was gripping and dark, a raw story of a drug-addicted streetwalker and a manipulative businessman. What ended up on screen was completely different. That was the point. Lawton watched it all happen from the sidelines. After being cut from his own project, he didn't even get final say on the tone. Still, the final script credit went to him. It barely resembled his work, but that credit changed his life. He sold another spec script soon after for $1 million. That one became Under Siege. So even in exile, he won. But some pieces of his original vision still haunt the edges. That bus scene, where Vivian stares blankly out the window as Kit rambles about Disneyland, that was supposed to be the final image. Two women trying to buy a childhood fantasy with the money they earned selling themselves. It was never meant to feel hopeful. Vivian's silence said it all. She knew nothing had changed. Edward was never coming back. The world had no rescue plan for girls like her. Then there was Kit. In the original version, she dies alone from an overdose. Another reminder that this wasn't a fairy tale, it was survival. Her death, just like her life, passed unnoticed. That storyline was erased completely. Julia Roberts later admitted she wouldn't have even taken the role if 3000 had stayed that way. In her words, she had no business being in a movie like that. Disney tested the darker version with early audiences, and it backfired hard. People cried. Some asked for refunds. No one wanted to watch Vivian get discarded like trash. They needed a win, a rescue, a reason to believe love could grow out of something so transactional. So the studio reshot the ending. The fire escape scene, Richard Gere climbing up with roses, the music swelling, the kiss, that's what tested well. That's what audiences wanted. And that's what made the movie iconic. Even the name had to go. 3000 sounded cold, even sci-fi. It reminded people this was all about money. Disney needed something sweeter, softer, romantic. Pretty Woman gave them that. And so, a dark drama about capitalism, addiction, and emotional detachment became one of the most beloved romantic comedies of the 90s. When Disney first bought the script for a film called 3000, they weren't even sure how the story was supposed to end. They started filming in July 1989 without a finalized ending, and for months, no one, including the actors, knew how things would wrap up. The original script was dark. Edward was cruel, Vivian was a drug addict, and the story ended with him throwing her out of his car and leaving her in a filthy alley with money tossed on top of her. It was meant to be a harsh look at class, money, and sex work in Los Angeles. But Disney, having just finished Beaches, wanted something a little edgy. but not too edgy. And they started to panic. To hedge their bets, they shot multiple endings. One where Edward leaves, one where she rides a bus to Disneyland, numb and hollow, and finally, one that no one expected to work, the fairy tale version. That last one wasn't even part of the original script. It was dreamed up during the chaos. Gary Marshall directed Julia Roberts with a very specific image in mind. He told her to imagine she was a little girl in a tower, waiting to be rescued. He turned a gritty cautionary tale into a storybook ending, one where Edward climbs the fire escape, despite his fear of heights, and Vivian meets him halfway. It was romantic, it was sweet, and it was totally opposite of how the story began. Test audiences were shown all the different endings. Every single time, they hated the sad ones. The audience couldn't stand the thought of Vivian being left behind, and they weren't shy about saying it. They felt betrayed, even angry, because the chemistry between Julia Roberts and Richard Gere was just too powerful. People didn't want gritty realism. They wanted magic. Even the screenwriter, J.F. Lawton, admitted later that once Julia and Richard were cast, it became impossible to end the story on a dark note. They were too good together. Disney was sweating. The original version was not only testing poorly, it was going to cost them a fortune if it failed. They had spent $14 million on the film. This wasn't a small project. It was a gamble. Jeffrey Katzenberg, who was leading Disney at the time, admitted it was tough convincing the company to even make a movie about a sex worker. But when those test screenings bombed, the studio realized they'd either have to accept a huge financial loss or completely reshape the movie to please audiences. So they chose the fairy tale, and it worked. When Pretty Woman was finally released on March 23, 1990, it exploded. The movie made over $463 million worldwide. It became the fifth highest-grossing film of all time back then, beating out Rain Man as the top-grossing R-rated movie in history until Terminator 2 passed it the next year. Adjusted for inflation, it would be worth nearly $1 billion today. That's more than some Marvel movies. It sold over 42 million tickets in the US alone, making it the most watched romantic comedy in American history. In the late 1980s, a gritty script called 3000 landed in Hollywood, telling the story of a woman named Vivian who lived on the edge of survival. She wasn't the red-dressed, wide-smiling Julia Roberts we know today. She was a cocaine addict, working the streets of Hollywood Boulevard, sharing a small apartment with her friend Kit, who coughed blood from too many nights with bad drugs. Vivian barely scraped enough to pay rent. Then came Edward, not a suave billionaire in a limo, but a cold corporate raider who saw people like numbers and relationships like contracts. In the original ending, after a transactional encounter, Edward threw a wad of cash on Vivian and kicked her out of his car into a filthy alley. That was it. No romance. No second glance. That version never saw the screen. Instead, what the world got in 1990 was Pretty Woman, the cleaned-up fairy tale that made $178.4 million and turned Julia Roberts into America's sweetheart. Disney bought the original script and turned it into a glossy love story. Vivian wasn't an addict anymore. Kit got the rough edges. Edward softened too. He went from Wall Street predator to charming rescuer. They turned the gritty cautionary tale into a Cinderella story, shopping sprees and all. Disney president Jeffrey Katzenberg led the charge, hiring new writers and turning a dark drama into a date-night fantasy. What was once a raw look at desperation became a bedtime story about luxury and love. Feminist critics didn't buy it. Since the 1990s, they've called out the film for selling a dangerous lie, that sex work leads to Prince Charming if you're pretty enough and willing to play along. In the real world, Women like Vivian don't get sweet upgrades. They get harassed, beaten, and trapped. They live without legal protection, without health care, without choices. Pretty Woman ignored all of that. It said that once Vivian wore designer clothes and got approval from a rich man, she was worth something. It wasn't empowerment. It was a sales pitch dressed in velvet gloves. Even the iconic big mistake, huge line wasn't rebellion. It was revenge through spending. Feminists say the film didn't fight the system. It taught women how to smile while surviving inside it. Film schools caught on. The original 3000 script became mandatory reading in classes about screenwriting. Students dissect how studios sanitize scripts, cutting out everything that makes them uncomfortable. They study how Disney stripped away the drugs, the desperation, the alleyway ending. Professors point to Pretty Woman as the moment the 1990s began. A clean break from the gritty, brutal stories of the 1970s like Taxi Driver or Midnight Cowboy. In those films, broken people stayed broken. In Pretty Woman, all it took was a makeover and a man. But here's the twist. J.F. Lawton, the original writer of 3000, wasn't bitter. He told Vanity Fair and U.S. Magazine in 2015 that he was thrilled with what happened. He wasn't a tortured artist trying to protect his vision. He was broke. He had written 7 scripts nobody wanted, most of them ninja flicks. Disney's offer was his big break. He said it was like designing a cabin and someone wanting to turn it into a skyscraper. Sure, it wasn't what he planned, but the view was better. Ironically, his first rewrite was still too dark, and Disney fired him before hiring others to finish the feel-good version. But he didn't care. It launched his career. Still, the industry changed forever. Hollywood in the 1970s was about pain, truth, endings that left you empty. But after box office disasters like Heaven's Gate, studios got scared. They wanted safe bets. By 1990, executives weren't chasing meaning. They were chasing markets. High concept was the rule. Stories had to fit on a poster. Pretty Woman fit perfectly. One sentence could sell it. Love, money, makeover, done. Its success wasn't just luck. It was a signal. Realism was out. Romance was in.